Marco Rubio is running Venezuela from Washington. That was the stunning conclusion from the New York Times this week, which reported that in the 6 months since the capture of Nicolas Maduro, the U.S. Secretary of State has become the de facto viceroy of Venezuela. The Times reports that Rubio effectively controls the nation's finances, the distribution of its natural resources, and its government. Our correspondent in Washington, Fraser Jackson, has more.
6 months after a daring raid which snatched Venezuelan President Maduro from his residence, the New York Times is offering new information about how the country is functioning. And effectively, it appears it is being run by Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. The Times says that Marco Rubio has become the, quote, de facto viceroy of Venezuela, something which has not been seen since the Americans occupied Iraq after the 2003 invasion of Iraq there. Then apparently his relationship with Delcy Rodriguez, who was the vice president of Maduro, is quite warm. They message each other over WhatsApp, they gossip on WhatsApp, send each other birthday messages and selfies as well. Now, the New York Times says that Marco Rubio is effectively controlling Venezuela's finances, the distribution of its natural resources, and its government. Now, the U.S. Treasury receives the revenue from most of Venezuela's exports and then holds on to that revenue and effectively sends the money back to Venezuela through its banking system, almost like a kind of pocket money or allowance for the country given to them by the United States. And Marco Rubio and his team are setting the conditions on what that money can be spent on as well, and also by whom, according to the New York Times. This setup, though, is said to be mutually beneficial. It has stopped corruption inside Venezuela and some of the more endemic schemes that were involved there. And it's also stopping creditors from seeking their debts from Venezuela, as the country is now effectively under the protection of the U.S. Treasury. It's also, though, giving Marco Rubio some control over the Vice President Rodriguez. Of course, he says his long-term goal while he was in the Senate was to restore democracy to parts of Latin America, but it appears that this is an altogether different kind of arrangement that we're seeing now from the U.S. Secretary of State. But his long-term goal, that is said by the New York Times, is to secure Venezuelan oil for U.S. interests.
That's our correspondent in Washington, Fraser Jackson, reporting. Well, for more on this story, I'm joined by Christopher Sabatini, director of Chatham House's Latin America program. Thanks so much for being with us here on France 24. Before we get into the mechanics of this, just give us a sense of how rare this is for an American official to be effectively running another country from his seat in Washington.
It's certainly rare in the modern world of diplomacy right now. There's, as your correspondent mentioned, there's an analogous situation with Paul Bremer in Iraq shortly after the removal of Saddam Hussein. But even in that case, there was much more a coordinated U.S. effort. In this case, basically, what has happened is Donald Trump elevated the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, to be the interim president. There's no schedule, not even any sort of talk of when elections will be held to establish a sort of elected government, a legitimately elected government in Venezuela. So basically, Marco Rubio is presiding over a government that basically has the exact same apparatus and the same vice president, now interim president, of the government of the president they removed, Nicolas Maduro, on January 3rd. So it's not even, they say, similar to Paul Bremer in Iraq, because there you had the post-Saddam Hussein government and the de-Baathification, which was perhaps a mistake, but you had a whole series of steps that led to elections to create a legitimate president. That's not in the cards right now, and Delcy Rodriguez is deeply unpopular. She was already unpopular during before the earthquake, and now her popularity rating is actually below 25%. So, yeah, he may be a viceroy, but his local counterparts and her, if you will, sort of security apparatus are not well liked within Venezuela itself.
As we heard from Fraser, the Times reports that Rubio frequently exchanges text messages in Spanish with the acting president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, and that Rubio is really the one pulling the strings. But how exactly does this relationship work, in your view?
I think it may be a little bit of a stretch for the New York Times to say that he's pulling the strings. Because first of all, this is Donald Trump's project. This is the one, and I think it will be temporary, but the one foreign policy success that he likes to cite. And quite frankly, the prospect of elections right now in Venezuela could potentially be destabilizing in a good way, in the sense that you will have mobilizations, you will have campaigning, you may have repression on the part of the government. And that's something that Donald Trump doesn't want to see. So we've heard Marco Rubio talk about the three stages after the removal of Nicolas Maduro. Basically the removal, then the economic recovery and stabilization, and eventually the transition. But we haven't heard is any sort of timeline for that transition. We haven't even heard Donald Trump say that timeline. And Donald Trump right now needs a foreign policy win. We see him back in Iran. We see the deadlock right now in Cuba, which is leading to many Cubans suffering and without any end in sight. So I think right now Donald Trump's still calling the shots. It's basically, though, that Marco Rubio is sort of the point person right now on Venezuela. And yes, I know from other sources that Delcy Rodriguez loves to WhatsApp. She loves to send emojis. I'm sure they're in regular contact. One of the former deputies of Marco Rubio, a man by the name of Mauricio Clavecaron, who's no longer in government, he's traveling frequently. He visits her. He helps to broker meetings between potential investors and Delcy Rodriguez. So yes, he is firmly in control. But I honestly think the person who's really calling the shots, certainly over the long term, is going to be President Donald Trump.
You just referred to this as a temporary situation. How long can this overall arrangement last? I mean, Trump won't be in office forever. Rubio won't be the Secretary of State at the end of this term. How do you see this playing out?
We really don't know, and they've not articulated a plan. This is not common for this administration's foreign policy, is to sort of engage in some sort of adventure, try to patch things together, as they did with the MOU in Iran, for example, and declare victory, and then not have that turn out to be the victory that they had pretended it to be. I suspect that's going to be the case in Venezuela. This window of opportunity that we're seeing, it closed significantly with these earthquakes, these two earthquakes. We're seeing massive amounts of public outrage over shoddily built buildings, really not particularly effective responses, military that stand on the sidelines and don't actually help citizens dig their relatives out and try to find bodies. I think really the sell-by date of Delcy Rodriguez as the interim president is getting very, very close. And there's going to have to need to be a long series of preparations for any elections, credible elections, to be held. We at Chatham House recently completed a roadmap for elections, and we estimated, given all the things that have to occur, from reforming and re-nominating a electoral commission to re-registering voters, making provisions for the 8 million or so Venezuelans, not all of them of voting age, obviously, but those that are, to be able to vote from abroad, and even testing the software and having primaries, and even determining which elections, presidential, congressional, gubernatorial, or mayoral, that all has to be decided on. You can't do that overnight. We estimated that would take at least 1 year and 4 months. And quite frankly, I don't know whether Venezuelans can hold on that much longer for that amount of time, waiting to have a legitimate government that they feel represents their interests. And we all know that Nicolas Maduro and Delcy Rodriguez in 2024, in July 2024, effectively stole the elections, never provided any evidence of their claims of victory. At best, Nicolas Maduro got 30%. So if you're an average voting Venezuelan, you're thinking, wait, we're in the midst of a natural disaster. The U.S. government is backing up this corrupt, autocratic government. When are we going to see actual real change that represents our views and our interests in government?
You know, Marco Rubio is not only the Secretary of State, he's also the acting national security advisor, which is also a very big job. How does he also now have the time to run Venezuela? And how does all of this impact his responsibilities and his portfolio, especially as the U.S.'s top diplomat?
Well, I think what we've seen him do is try to stay away from some of the more controversial policies, dedicate himself more to Latin America. We all knew he was going to be more of a Latin America-focused president. He's Cuban-American, grew up in Florida, has, as a Cuban-American whose parents didn't flee Fidel Castro, but he grew up in a very hothouse environment around Cuban politics and anti-communism. For him, this is really sort of a lifetime mission, removing the government, or at least installing an interim government that was basically propping up the Cuban regime and also supporting the Nicaraguan Sandinista government of Daniel Ortega. What we are seeing is really this is his life's mission. Now, he wants to run for president in 2028. That's not a secret. But if he can deliver on meaningful regime change in Venezuela and in Cuba, two things which I really think are in question now. If he can't deliver that, he'll have a difficult time because his constituency in Florida will not look upon him favorably.
As for the economics of this, the Times likens this arrangement between the U.S. and Venezuela as parents handing out an allowance to children. What do you think could cause that power dynamic to change?
So first of all, it's important to note that about $8 billion have been collected by the U.S., deposited originally Qatari bank, and then another bank, $8 billion of profits. $3 billion of it has now gone to the Venezuelan government. And when the government makes the requests, it's an accounting firm that goes through those requests and checks the receipts. It's a very, very tight relationship, a very controlling, almost neo-patrimonial relationship, if you will. But the Venezuelans are now beginning to ask. The U.S. only has offered right now about $300 million of aid after the earthquakes. People are asking, whatever happened to that other $5 billion of Venezuelan oil profits? And Donald Trump has insinuated that basically that was kept by the United States to basically pay for the military buildup and the extraction of Nicolas Maduro and the operation that got him out. I don't know if that's true or not, but Donald Trump has insinuated that's the case. And again, we're beginning to see signs of rejection. There are actually now popular protests in front of the U.S. Embassy in Caracas, protesting basically, where's the money? And where's the accountability? And where are the elections?
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Christopher Sabatini, director of Chatham House's Latin America program. We always appreciate your perspective. Thanks for joining us here on France 24.
Thank you. Appreciate it.